Hi, and welcome to another edition of Boston Sci-Fi Podcast. Today's episode is The Body Horrific, a look at body horror in movies. And joining us are two of my favorite horror people, Alexis Boggende and Alex DiVincenzo. Too many Alexes there for my poor brain to work on. Uh, so let's start off. What is the difference between horror and body horror? And Alexis, I actually think you gave us the idea for this thing. So why don't you start?
Yeah, to me at least, and I'm curious to see what Alex says, but to me, body horror is very much about like the physical manipulation of the body in like the most grotesque, disturbing, disgusting ways possible, and really driving home a aspect in horror that is typically, I don't know, not super popular, and that's there are fates worse than death, which you can see in Tusk, you can see in Human Centipede. I don't. I would personally rather die than be made into a centipede and or a walrus with my own skin. So yeah, I think it's very much just the manipulation of the human body in ways that it just is almost beyond uh, audience's comprehension. But yeah, I'm really curious to see what Alex thinks about that.
So Alex, what do you think?
No, I think that was eloquently put. It's a broader topic than kind of I originally considered. You kind of hear body horror. The Cronenberg is kind of the go-to. Basically, his whole filmography. If you're looking at a best of body horror list, he's got like half of it. But yeah, some of the other titles we're talking about tonight did not immediately spring to mind as body horror, despite being movies I love. And yeah, they are usually, particularly in a post Cronenberg era. They are very goopy, gory, gross. But then you have something like Frankenstein you could consider body horror, and that's classic horror. But yeah, it's broad. There's a lot you can do with it, and I'm excited to talk about more.
Well, let's start off with our first clip, and our first clip is from David Cronenberg, and it is The Fly from 1986. And here's The Fly.
No, no, up here. Got pretty good at it, haven't I? Yeah, it's almost second nature. Stop biting my nails. Oh, look at this. What's this? I don't know. I seem to be stricken by a disease with a purpose, wouldn't you say? Maybe not such a bad disease after all.
I can't stay.
No, no, no. Why not? Why can't you?
I can't take it. It's too much.
What's it gonna take? The disease has just revealed its purpose. We don't have to worry about contagion anymore. I know what the disease wants.
What does the disease want?
It wants to turn me into something else. That's not too terrible, is it? Most people would give anything to be turned into something else.
Turned into what?
What do you think, a fly? Am I becoming a 185-pound fly? No, I'm becoming something that never existed before. I'm becoming Brundle Fly.
So I read some stuff about this that Cronenberg was talking about disease and aging, and that another person said that it was all about the deterioration of a relationship, and that that they're just using it to personify the body horror, using to personify that. Does that have any validity at all? And Alex, I'll start with you on that one.
Um, Tough to say. I do think I had never heard the relationship angle. I had heard kind of like maybe AIDS or something because it was around that era. But the relationship angle I think is super interesting because it's as grotesque as a movie as it is. It's also like weirdly romantic. Um, the kind of the budding romance between them, and then the divide between Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum, who were dating at the time, kind of adds an extra layer to it. No, that's very fascinating. I like that a lot. I need to rewatch it with that in mind.
Alexis, have you ever had a relationship where the other person was falling apart?
I have not. James is not going through that, so that's really good. No, but I think like Alex said, I think that's a really interesting angle. I had also not heard of that. I've definitely heard the AIDS one before, and that's something I really love about Cronenberg stuff is that it just all of his stuff feel like Alex was saying. His most of his filmography is body horror. I love him. I think he's brilliant. Very good writer too. He has a book called Consumed that is disgusting. That like shameless Cronenberg book plug. It's a very good book. But something I love about him is that everything I can, not gonna, no pun intended, consume of like his is all just feels sicky. Like I feel sick and gross. And like he has a short film called Nest, and it's like very strange short film where it's just him and the actress, and he's filming it. You can never see his face, but he's like playing a doctor, and she's basically complaining to him that she has like a nest of bugs living in her breast, and it is the strangest thing ever. But that is like one of the top ones that have left me feeling so sick, and that's something I really love about his is that it just makes you feel disease. Everything feels like disease ridden, and it's something I love about Cronenberg.
Have you ever given any consideration about what drives Cronenberg to do these kinds of films? I'll just toss it out there. What part of the psyche, somehow dreams up these disgusting images and then puts them on screen and makes a career out of it?
It's an interesting question because I feel like there's other filmmakers in the genre who kind of got pigeonholed early on. Carpenter's a famous example. Had a hit with Halloween, and then he could only ever make horror movies, more or less. But Cronenberg, whether he's doing it, independently at a studio level, he's always, almost always, I should say, within the genre or very close to it. And again, he's kind of synonymous with body horror, and it's interesting because he's again as grotesque as they are, his work is also cerebral. I do think there's meaning, there's depth behind it. Something like Human Centipede, which we'll talk about later, is kind of could be argued that's a little more shock value, although that's not to say it doesn't have something to say or value. But I think somebody like Cronenberg takes such an intelligent approach to the genre, and makes you feel how malleable it is with how much he does with it.
Is that something we should be aware of, that some of the films that are body horror are just there for shock value and don't have the intelligence or something more behind the screen?
It's kind of up to the viewer. I think somebody could watch a Cronenberg movie and just take it at face value and not dig any deeper below the surface and kind of miss any whatever social commentary or other meaning, what have you. And some movies only deliver that, and that's okay too. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with some mindless popcorn entertainment, or maybe not popcorn during some of these movies, but yeah, I think it's kind of up to the viewer whether they want to engage with it at another level or not.
There's always been horror and body horror have always been around. If you take a look at even Edgar Allan Poe, some of his stuff could be classified as that. And then H.P. Lovecraft for sure. And that leads us to our next thing, which is Stuart Gordon's Re-Animator, which is, again, from the 80s, which seems to be a very seminal period for body horror. And I'm wondering whether the 80s somehow elicited that kind of response from people, that they wanted to make films that showed disgusting human stuff going on at the time. Well, was it the AIDS epidemic? Was it the Reagan era? Was it, what was it? What was it about the 80s that started driving this? Any thoughts at all?
I do think you touched on both the major points. I think AIDS epidemic and the Reagan era kind of pushing back against that. But on a more kind of surface level is just, I think the effects artists were all just trying to one up each other. They were like the rock stars of the film industry. And, you can only, once the slasher boom kind of fizzled out in the early 80s, there's only so many different ways you can kill people with a knife. they kind of got more and more creative and more and more disgusting.
So wait a minute. Your supposition here is that it was all driven by the artist, the special effects artists trying to like really do a better job, the Rick Bakers of the world.
Listen, they all wanted to get that Fangoria cover, you know? It's like the Wheaties box of the horror industry.
Well, anyways, here's a clip from Re-Animator by Stuart Gordon.
My God!
You idiots will blow my notes. I have to record this. No! Dr. Gruber? Dr. Gruber, wie geht's dir? Dr. Gruber?
It is told. Of course he's dead. The dosage was too large.
You killed him.
No, I did not. I gave him life.
I love that. Jeffrey Combs is Herbert West. I actually read it was something where someone speculated on how smart Herbert West was, and they said he had a IQ of 200. I'm not sure where that came from, but again, it's Stuart Gordon did a great job of taking that thing and going back to what you were saying, Alex, about the special effects. I mean, some of those special effects is a little hokey, and I'm not sure that we would accept it as much. But back in in the 80s, that was really cutting edge stuff, and it was a wonderful scene. And the later scenes where it's just the head talking was wonderful as well. Is Re-Animator holding up well as a film in the 2024 period?
I think it is. I mean, I think, at least for me, I still love it. I think it's really effective. I think despite it being a little hokey, I like effects wise, I still think it's really impactful. And I actually wish, movies nowadays had that instead of the crap CGI that sometimes is offered. I love practical effects. So I think it will stand the test of time. I think it continues to do so. But that's just me. I mean, I think, same thing with I know we'll talk about it in a little bit, but like The Thing, I think, that could be argued that, maybe it looks a little hokey compared to, modern standards, but I still think, the effects are insane compared to, what we have today. But.
Well, Alex, there seems to be a motif in these movies where the scientist, the evil scientist, no matter what his motivation is a bad person manipulating other people. And is this a fear that we have, that science and or scientists are going to do bad by us?
I think it is a little bit of fear, maybe not scientists per se, but science in general, and just kind of extends to the unknown, life after death. I think they all kind of go hand in hand. It's scary not to know. It's interesting. I had never thought about it until I rewatched it in preparation for this show. How close Herbert West Re-Animator, the short story, and Frankenstein were to being published. They were published within, I forget the exact dates, but like 4 years, 6 years. I think Re-Animator came second. But it's interesting because there's obviously very easy to draw parallels between the two of them, both in how they deal with kind of mad scientists and life after death.
Well, with Frankenstein, though, it's more of Industrial Revolution kind of stuff, a reaction to Industrial Revolution. I don't see that with Re-Animator. I see Re-Animator just being a scientist gone amok.
Yeah, that's a good point. I I read it many years ago, the short story, and it didn't stick with me. I recall it not being too similar to what ended up on screen in the film. I think they took a lot of artistic liberties, but I'm glad they did, because I think not only do we have the amazing effects, but one of my favorite things about Re-Animator is the sense of humor, the very dry. I laugh at cat dead details later every time. It's like, I don't know, just kind of the deadpan delivery, and Jeffrey Combs just chewing the scenery every time he's on screen.
I really think, I mean, I had a chance to spend some time with Stuart Gordon, and I think that humor was almost Shakespearean for him, because just like Shakespeare, you wanted to have some humor in it just to break the tension so you could bring the tension back up.
Yeah.
But you know, Alexis, you mentioned The Thing, and some of the special effects were kind of a little hokey. Here's a clip from The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing.
So you sweethearts are about to have yourselves a little lynching party, huh? Well, I might just have to put an end to you on general principles, Knowles. Ever occur to the jury that anybody could have got some of my clothes and stuck them up the furnace?
We ain't buying that.
Quit that bickering over there. Windows, wheel that defibrillator over here. Put some grease on those panels.
You're gonna have to sleep sometime, McCready.
Oh, a real light sleeper, child. Anyone tries to wake me.
Clear! Clear!
Clear?
They always seem to come out of the chest.
Such a great scene. That is such a good scene.
Again, in my research for doing this piece, one of the motifs that was being talked about was the monster, when it didn't take a human form, would take a form that was particularly fearful. Humans are particularly fearful of, spiders, whatever, something along those lines. And I'm always surprised when I look at this film and I start reading about it, how it flopped at the box office and now is considered a really big hit. In fact, John Carpenter says it flopped, I was fired. So what is it about this particular film that is able to take it off the dustbin of flop, become a cult classic?
I mean, I default to think that it, like, something I love about The Thing is that I think it really gets into the depths of like some of man's worst fears. You have the isolation, the snowstorm is closing, it's super claustrophobic. You have an alien life force coming in and literally ripping apart everyone in the most grotesque ways possible. But I think having that claustrophobia and that isolation and this darkness and this like complete, at the end, Childs and McCready are faced off, and basically you don't know what's going to happen to them. It's probably not a good thing to either of them. I think it just, that loneliness and that darkness really feeds into man's worst fear. I think like very, very primal fears. That's something I love about The Thing. And I wonder if that has to do with it. Because I know like Tarantino, especially with like The Hateful Eight, took a lot of that from The Thing. So we're seeing it, in cinema today. So I think it's really kind of cool that it flopped, but it's now become a cult classic and it's still influencing films. But that's my take on it.
Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I think people talk about it at first because of the effects. I mean, it has like 3 or 4 just kind of all-timer practical effects sequences. But then when you sit down and watch the whole movie, everything between that is like really good character-based, dialogue-driven horror. And I think that is kind of the effects get people in the door, maybe not during the theatrical run, but since it's been kind of passed down, got people to watch it, and then they actually see, oh no, there's a lot more to this movie than just some cool effects. Like the scene we just watched, again, that's an all timer, and then like 10 minutes after that is the blood test scene, which I think is just a brilliant sequence, one of the best horror suspense pieces ever. And yeah, I mean, it never hurts to have Carpenter and Kurt Russell team up. That's a no-brainer in my book.
Isn't it kind of surprising? I've always thought that Kurt Russell was kind of a B actor, but he's created a really nice career for himself, and he just keeps going and going and going. It's kind of amazing, you know.
It just, I mean, he has never-ending charisma. Like you say, even now, like he's in the new Godzilla series. It's just like the camera still loves him, and he still loves it. So
yeah, he's all. I'm a big Kurt Russell fan. I think he's really good. And yeah, Garen, I'd agree. You know, when I think of like A-list Hollywood actor, I don't think Kurt Russell, but Kurt Russell is very good, and I always enjoy watching him in basically everything he's in. So.
One of my favorite films of his is something that didn't get a lot of traction. Was a film called Soldier, where he is a kind of a created mannequin of a soldier, and he has to save these people and stuff like that. But it's that, you know, I think it's just amazing that he is doing so well. Let me ask one other question about before we move off of The Thing. Was The Thing ahead of its time? The loneliness and desperation that you were talking about, Alexis.
Yeah.
Was that something that was, you know, that came later in the 80s and then in the 90s versus the early 80s when this film was made? So was it ahead of its time?
It's a great question. I mean, like, just at my first thought, just off the top of my head, I would say I think it is. Effects, definitely. The themes of like loneliness, claustrophobia, fear of the dark sort of thing. I mean, that's, you know, a primal thing that goes back ages and ages and ages. But when I think of like really notable 80s movies that tackle that sort of thing, I would, you know, I default to The Thing. Because I think there's just so great at establishing that, especially the scene, and the character's name is escaping me, but he runs out into the snow and they burn him with the flamethrower. I remember seeing that when I was young, and it has like burned itself, no pun intended, into my memory.
That's great. I agree with you.
So like the sound and like the sound effects and just the sound mix in The Thing is so terrifying. Like, I don't know if you guys remember the sound he makes.
I was just going to bring that up when you mentioned that howl or whatever you call it.
Oh my God, right, Alex? It's just like
it burrows its way into you. Yeah.
I will never forget what that sounds like. I think he's like staring right up at McCready, and he makes that sound, or The Thing makes the sound, and it's like, oh my God, I'll never forget that for the rest of my life. But I hope that answered your question, Garen. I think I went off on a tangent.
Do you have any thoughts about that, Alex?
No.
What was the film ahead?
I think I'd never thought about it before, but now that you mention it, I feel like less so than late 80s into the 90s as opposed to now. I think, granted, we still have like, you know, Blumhouse movies that are kind of your popcorn entertainment, which is nothing wrong with that. That's good. But you also see a lot of kind of grief and trauma based horror, or at least rooted in that. Something like a Smile or even the new Halloween movies kind of touched on that. And I think you could, I'm not necessarily saying The Thing started it or was a direct inspiration, but I think you kind of draw a straight line from that into kind of our modern, more emotionally based horror, for lack of a better name.
That's a really good point.
That is a really good point. And it struck a question into me is when we look at very early horror, you know, like in the 20s and the 30s and then into the 40s. And then you look at horror in the aughts and the teens and the 2020s. Mm-hmm. It's much more visceral and more grabbing and more primal. And is that because the technique is there, or is it because we as an audience need to be shocked more every time we see something?
I would almost say maybe shocked. I don't know if shocked is the right word that I want to use, but like kind of going back to what Alex said, I think at least for me, like emotional and like grief-based horror is unbelievably effective for me. Like when I saw Hereditary, that completely just like I have never been so affected, on seeing a movie. And so I wonder if bringing this like intensity of grief and trauma and sadness in mixing it with horror, like a lot of people are doing nowadays, is making it more effective, and that kind of influences a shock factor. Because while, like, say for instance, like Hereditary, Midsommar, or any of Ari Aster's latest stuff does, is that yeah, there is shock factors. You see people getting sewn into bears and setting on fire, and a little girl losing her head against a pole. But it's also like those are shocking moments. But overarching, the film is really rooted in like emotion and trauma and grief. So I wonder if those two things go hand in hand, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense, and I think that there's something about giving almost a touchstone to a raw emotion and having it visually shown on the screen makes the audience have a stronger connection to the film. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think so.
Definitely.
Well, changing gears a bit, we're going to go with something we've talked about before, which is the film Upgrade, which to me has I think it's one of the better films that's come out in a number of years, because it deals with the technology of changing someone's body. So here's a clip from Upgrade and the STEM getting into the protagonist.
Nobody can know. They make people like me wait years to test something like this. But I can't wait for them. Signing confidentiality agreements is never fun, but I bet it will feel good to do it with your own hand.
Who's moving my arms and my legs, me or your widget?
You're the one doing it all. You're not a robot. STEM works in service of your brain. Your brain gives STEM a command. He makes it happen.
So the body horror here is not so blatant, other than the fact that something is inserted in your body and starts controlling you. Is this film justifiably a body horror film, or are we stretching the definition?
Can I have a hot take and say yes? And I think a lot of cyberpunk could be categorized as horror. Not necessarily all body horror, but I do think it can be heavily categorized in the horror category, because no one has a good time in cyberpunk, like ever. So I think it's body horror. I think Gray's fate is absolutely horrific. He has no control over his body. He's worse off, at the end of the movie than he was at the beginning. Another common theme in cyberpunk. And I don't know, he has basically no control because of something that's been implanted and manipulated in his body. So to me, I think Upgrade is a really great body horror movie. And I think Leigh Whannell is really brilliant. This movie's one of my favorites.
So with cyberpunk and a body horror and the concept of control, is that something that we feel is particularly pertinent now in 2024 than, say, it was before COVID? What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, I'd never really thought about it in those terms, but now that you put it like that, I would say absolutely. No matter what kind of end of the socio-political spectrum you're on, I think you could probably find a stance within the movie And you could use it to justify your stance, I should say, whether it's who has the control, who's abusing the power, etc. Yeah, I think that's a pretty fascinating lens to view it through.
All right, so now we when we were putting this all together, Irene and Mark, our producer and director, respectively, we had a hard time just limiting what we talked about. So obviously we had to come up with an honorable mention reel. And so here is our honorable mentions reel of body horror films. All right. Is there any one of those that you want to comment on?
Tusk always.
Tusk always. You're a big Tusk fan, huh?
I remember seeing it in the theater in college, and I took my friends, and I got a lot of shit after that. Like, Alexis, what the hell did you bring us to? I'm like, it's body horror. It's fun. The ending of Tusk is, I know we talked about, how body horror really signifies like fate's worse than death. I don't know if you guys remember the ending of Tusk, but it's literally like they can't unsew Justin Long out of the walrus suit, so they put him in like a really sad like wildlife park in Canada, and like his friend and his girlfriend have since gotten together, and they like throw him a fish and he comes out and eats the fish. It is like the most despairing, dismal ending to anything, and I think it's so effective in doing that. And I know it's kind of like played for comedy, but I think Tusk is like so horrifying. Yeah, I always want to comment on Tusk.
Alex, was there anything that any of those honorable mentions that you noticed or wanted to talk about, or did we miss something?
Definitely glad to see the Society clip again. Worthy of watching.
We like
twice.
that one, yeah.
Yeah. Also very happy to see Love for the Beach House. I think that's a underrated, underseen kind of gem, and locally produced. But yeah, no, I think it's a great list.
Well, all right, so let's move on to our last film, which I remember when I first saw this, I'm just going, oh my God, Human Centipede. Here's a clip of Human Centipede.
V-shaped incisions below the chins of B and C, up to their cheeks. Connecting the circular mucosa and skin parts of anus and mouth from A to B and B to C. Connecting the pedicellated grafts to the chin cheek incisions from A to B and B to C, creating a Siamese triplet connected via the gastric system. Ingestion by A, passing through B, the Discretion of sea. The Human Centipede.
I read, I think there's, again, one of the taglines was 100%,
medically accurate or something.
Medically accurate.
And then a couple of doctors go, absolutely not. So to me, I mean, I'm sure there are elements of this film that we can say are, have some more intellectual thing, but I think this was really designed to try and create what you've been talking about, Alexis, a fate worse than death and a completely revolting film that's going to draw people to it. I mean, is there something redeemable about this film?
So maybe you guys might think I'm thinking way too far into it, but so I've always thought, yes, well, when it came out, we're like, oh my God, the Human Centipede. And, I think, yes, there's like so much of it is, very much like shock value and like to disgust you. But I think if you do want to look at it in more of like a analytical lens, so Tom Six did it. It's a film out of the Netherlands. He's Dutch. He's a generation older than I am. I'm a millennial first generation Dutch, raised by a Dutch guy. And I have to say, like, the knowledge of World War II and Nazi experimentation is past. I knew about it, like I was taught it. I learned all about the Holocaust when I was very, very young from, just having family involved in World War II in the Netherlands. And I think I read something from Tom Six saying that it influenced him, the Nazi experimentations and concentration camps and, stuff that Mengele was doing at Auschwitz. So I do think there is like a heavy influence of that there. Again, just have been raised in a Dutch family, like that shit is talked about really, really early. And it's, it never goes away. So I do wonder if, having Tom Six having said that has really influenced him. And if you kind of look at it in that lens, because, there was some absolutely horrific, like unimaginable things that was happening at Auschwitz. And I think that has influenced the Human Centipede a bit, especially in the conjoined twins subject. So that's kind of my take on a more analytical look at Human Centipede.
Well, I can see the Joseph Mengele side,
yeah,
because again, if we know anything about some of the atrocities that were copped under the fascist Nazi regime, that was one of the more disgusting pieces about it.
Of course, right.
And so, do you think that the director was somehow making a comment on, what is emerging as, the right resurgence in Europe and what it could lead to? Would that be a way of kind of connecting those dots?
I don't know if, because you read stuff like that from Tom Six, and then you also read him being like, I thought of it when I think he said like what he'd like to do to like pedophiles is like connect them like ass to mouth or something like that. So you hear like really deeply analytical things from him on that scope, and then you hear stuff like that. So I don't know if he thought that far ahead, but I do think he was partially influenced from, his understanding of what went on in World War II in concentration camps and Nazi experimentation. I think he was influenced. I don't know if he was thinking that far ahead to implement that theme for that reason, if that makes sense.
Well, Alex, chime in here at any point. I mean, the fact is that the protagonist doctor looks like Mengele, talks like Mengele.
He does. He really does. Yeah.
So, but do you think that the audiences watching this film take that away from it, or is it just shock values? I mean, it is kind of gross and disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, I think this more than any other movie we talked about really kind of immediately penetrated pop culture just because it's so gross.
Yeah.
I remember I watched it once. The only time I'd watched it prior to this, it was one of those like, oh, I'm glad I watched it, but I don't need to watch it again. It was like, a group of friends. I was, the horror guy, so they knew I would watch it, and they were just watching it because they wanted to see like how gross it got. so when I revisited it for this conversation, I was kind of pleasantly surprised. It is gross. It is, it's the so-called torture porn era. Very much leans heavily into that, which I could do without. But it's also, as Alexis touched on earlier, like it is showing you like a fate worse than death. It's kind of like, in a lot of these movies, I as I'm watching it, thinking like, oh, what would I do in this situation? And many times in the Human Centipede, it was like, oh, I would just die. Like there's no there's no good outcome for this. Like I'd rather death than torture, especially as cruel and unusual a torture as this. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure if there was any underlying commentary to be made. But even if you just take it as a weird, gross experiment, I think it's successful.
Are we going to see more films like this in the future? Probably.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Especially since Tom Six is like, I'm going to do something crazier. You're like, Tom, please. Like,
Well, they did. They made a couple of sequels of Human Centipede that were just not as good.
they're like purposefully goofy. Where I
Yeah,
think
they lean into the camp.
Yeah, and I think this one he was like, not as camp, and then he went full throttle. The second and third sequence, as he calls it. So,
But I do think anything with like a easy kind of elevator pitch title or plot synopsis that's gross or weird or that stands out is gonna be made and gonna make waves.
Where do we see? I mean, when you mentioned that, Alex, I'm started thinking of Sisu. That film came out of nowhere. It has a lot of violence in it, but it struck pop culture again, and I enjoyed the heck out of it.
Yeah, it was
I mean,
great.
do we see films like this coming from other areas of the globe rather than just the U.S.? Is there something like Indian horror or Japanese horror or something like that is going to pick it up and run with it? Are you seeing anything out there like that?
I can't recall anything recent that's really struck me in the body horror realm that wasn't made by a Cronenberg, father or son. But Japanese, there was a Tetsuo clip in the honorable mentions. I mean, they've definitely done a lot. Kind of maybe what I'm trying to think of how to word this through a different cultural lens, different cultural perspective.
Yes.
That still falls within the body horror realm, but kind of not something that we as Americans would be expecting, which is always exciting. I think I would look to South Korea, actually, not necessarily body horror, but just kind of the weird genre stuff that I don't know. They're like taking more risks, doing more interesting, weird stuff that we're not getting. Certainly not in theaters, but even on independent level. That's I don't know. That's one of my favorite countries to watch movies from.
I would think maybe Mexico as well, or someplace in South America where they would take some of that Catholic tradition and just kind of like really warp it, and so that there'd be some sort of connection there that people would get it, but it would still be something new.
I saw that reminds me. I saw someone call The First Omen a body horror movie, which I mean could fit into that, definition. I mean, maybe religious horror primarily, but certainly any horror movie dealing with pregnancy you could call body horror.
Well, guys, that's about it for this episode. Thank you very much. Alexis, what's going on in your world? What can you shamelessly pimp something for yourself?
Let's see. Lots of fun horror movies coming out this summer that I'm looking to cover. So stay tuned for that on Boston Hassle. Same thing with my work at Daily Grindhouse, which is great. In the meantime, in between, I'm working on a book. So working on that. And just
You're working on a book?
Yes, I'm always working on a book. It just takes me ages to write it. So yeah, but yeah, going to be covering like Cuckoo and the new M. Night Shyamalan movie. So a bunch of fun stuff coming up. So yeah.
And Alex, what's going on in your world?
For those that don't know, I run a site called Broke Horror Fan, which kind of highlights horror movie merchandise and memorabilia. And through that, I have a line of modern horror films on VHS. We're working on kind of our lineup for the latter half of the year right now with some cool stuff I'm excited about. I also write for Bloody Disgusting. You can find my work there. Alex's Legend on Twitter, Brocarfan on Instagram. Hit me up and talk movies.
Cool. All right, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. I also want to thank Mark Sherwood, our director, and Irene Leite, our producer, who put this all together. You can find us on YouTube or at any place you can find your podcast. Our next episode, which will be in July, will be on character actors, part 1, because there are so many great character actors out there, and we just couldn't narrow it down. But thank you for joining us. And as we exit this particular podcast, here is a clip of a teaser for our next thing on character actors. Again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
You.